Well, should we talk about some news?
Yeah, let's get to it.
News time.
News. All right. Well, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Expungement board, which people have probably heard about before, mostly because if you're a listener to the show, we've talked about it on here before. We're also a little bit later going to dig deep into a couple different bills that were introduced to the legislature since we last spoke, looking at the medical side, looking at the native side, looking a little bit more at cannabis in Minnesota. And then at the way end of our episode today, after that interview with Dr. Dabbs, you'll be hearing a deep dive on one of those measures specifically. So stick around. We got a whole legislative slew for this one. But should we talk about the Expungement board?
Yes, sir.
All right. So expungement was a huge part of House File 100. That's not something new to anyone that's listening to our podcast, but we know that an expungement is a really long process. How do we go about taking some of the people that have these criminal convictions and still allowing them to be part of the industry? Or alternatively, not part of the industry, but just removing these criminal penalties that they have against them, having these marks on their record removed because, hey, it's legal now and we probably shouldn't punish people for something that they did so long ago that now today would be entirely legal.
Yeah, and I think it came up a bunch last year during the bill process. Is like, we don't want to be like, oh, you got harmed because of weed, so you have to go into weed. Mm-hmm. It's like, no, you got harmed because of weed. We're going to undo that harm.
Absolutely.
Just let you be a person now. Just let you be a normal citizen.
Make it easier to get jobs, to get housing, for whatever be it. So let's talk through what that expungement board is starting to look like. So when it first passed in House File 100, we had a rough idea of who would be on it, or at least whose appointees would be on it. Now the board is starting to come together a little more. We not only know who some of the appointed members are, but we also now know who that chair of the board is going to be. So Governor Walz just this past week announced that James Rauder is going to be the chair of that expungement board.
He should really come on and tell us how to say it.
Yeah, we would love that. Come on our podcast and tell us that, along with so many other things. But he's someone that really has a lot of background on that criminal justice and reparative harm side. He's someone who used to work for the city of Minneapolis. He's someone who has worked as the director of people and culture for the Minnesota ACLU. He's really focused on how can we take some of the harms of criminal justice and help to repair them. Someone that I think is a pretty good person to be running this board.
Yeah, I think on paper that's a great choice. I'm excited to see how he gets going on.
Yeah, I think the on paper comment is really good. It's sort of like looking at someone's resume and maybe they're great for the job, but sometimes they get in and wow, that was a lot of talk. And we don't mean to be harsh while someone gets appointed, but definitely we are hoping that we see that effort coming through some of the work of the board.
We're only even mentioning this because like not all of the governor's appointees have been the right person so far. So it's like, let's let him get in there, let him do his work, and then we can judge for real.
Wait, I'm confused. Is there an appointee that didn't work out, or no? We'll move on. So let's talk about who.
Observing Rupri. Yeah.
So let's talk about who James is going to be serving alongside. We've got Chief Judge Susan Siegel, who is the Chief Justice of who is the Chief Judge of the Minnesota Court of Appeals. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is able to make that appointment. They chose the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, which is like that one level down, but still a really important role. Someone who has had a lot of role in looking at overturning some of these convictions will now be doing a similar work for the expungement board.
I think that'll be a good choice. It's nice having a high-level judge on there. The public defender, Amanda Broadhag, she was appointed by the governor, right?
Yeah, so she was appointed by the governor. She is that assistant public defender in Hennepin County.
Okay,
but another governor picked.
That's, it's interesting who picks these people as well as who these people are because that's...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they gave a seat to the attorney general or a designee. They haven't yet chosen who that person is. They gave that seat to the Supreme Court, as we previously talked about. They gave a seat to the governor through that public defender lens. They gave another seat, technically, to the governor through the commissioner of corrections, which is the person that the governor picks them. I get they're technically choosing who's on the board, but it's technically the governor picking them as well. And then we also have one public member who also was appointed by the governor, and that's Rebecca St. George. She has previous experience working for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, and so someone who I think provides a unique perspective as they move forward with expungement.
And she's also another city attorney.
Yeah.
So
a lot of municipal employees that are going into this board.
yeah.
I'm excited to see what the work of this board looks like. I think there's a lot of, as you mentioned, potential that could be filled. I'm optimistic. I'm hesitantly optimistic.
Yeah, I think we have to be optimistic about it though, because it's like you said earlier, the expungements were such a big part of the bill. It's like after we had all the automatic stuff, this is when the real work begins, and I'd love to see their pace and what they're, because most of everything they have to do is just set in statute. So it's like you guys don't have to go looking for what you have to do. You just have to set up the processes.
And there are thousands of individuals that are eligible for expungement under this. So definitely some important work for them to be doing. All right, let's touch a little bit on the legislature, because we've got a couple bills that were recently introduced. So we want to start off this conversation with a fun caveat that we used to add in past legislative sessions, which is there's a lot of bills that have been introduced. The number of bills that have had a hearing in both the House and the Senate are added up to the amount of coffee that is inside of this cup, which is none. We've had no hearings yet here in Minnesota, which is, I'm sure people know the legislative process by now. We've been doing this for a while, but it needs to go through that before it can ever go to the House, before it can ever fully pass, before it can ever go to the Senate or the governor. It needs to go to committee.
Yep.
And as of right now,
usually multiple committees.
Oh,
so
yeah.
It's I think you said as of now 0 so far. We're week 3 this week.
Yep. Yeah. So hopefully we see the legislature continue to advance forward. But more to come. But that being said, we still wanted to talk about some of the bills that were introduced, because as we saw last session, there can be a lot of waiting, and then very quick movement. And so we could see some of these be given hearings and moving through the process relatively quickly. But as of right now, nothing. But let's talk about the bills. So the first one that we want to talk about is one that has definitely gotten a lot of coverage over the last couple of days. It's a bill that looks at how cannabis is acquired by some of the native nations here in Minnesota and tries to provide them an additional path to get that cannabis, at least to legally get that cannabis, which would be buying it through the medical companies here in Minnesota. Yeah. So in essence, if a tribal nation wanted to start up a licensed dispensary, they wanted to do, whatever kind of sales, they could buy cannabis directly from the medical manufacturers.
And I'll say this is like I personally am into this. It's one of the things that I think can more efficiently help solve some of our issues, especially around supply. It's like these medical companies are sitting on all this stuff. We have tribal groups that are able to sell this stuff. Yeah. The connection seems easy enough, but like you said, it hasn't even been heard yet. I don't even think it's fully fleshed out.
No, it's a pretty short text as of right now.
This pilot will look like.
Yeah.
So watch on the buildup of that, but we do need to get dispensaries before 2025. Any way, anyhow, that is the goal. So yeah. I think this will be good. So until March 2025, that's when they have to either have their own supply or start going to.
Correct.
So that's like an interesting caveat, because if I had to look at a crystal ball, I would say that the medical companies are going to fight like hell to take out that March 2025 part.
Bingo. Or I think what we could see is it pass now as a pilot program.
Yeah.
They do it for a year and say, this went really well, or it didn't. But imagine it went really well and say, we need to continue this even past 2025.
Yeah. And even if it expires that March, they'll have the bill ready.
Yeah.
Bang, to continue it.
I will say, when I first heard about this bill, I think my initial thought was like, well, I'm not the hugest fan of the medical companies, but I think sort of looking at how we want to actually allow native nations to become part of our cannabis industry, providing them a route using the people that currently exist in Minnesota, I think is a good way to do it. Now, the one thing I will throw in there is I've heard people say there's only 2 companies that are legally growing cannabis in Minnesota today. I would push back and say we have a whole hemp industry here in Minnesota that probably could also help supply if given the permission to grow. But that's whole thing aside,
whole deal.
Yeah, right? That whole thing aside, we at least have medical companies that are growing today. We have native nations that are looking to expand access to cannabis. No. This seems like one of those things that, and I get it.
Like, depending on how this pilot program ends up, this is our fastest way to dispensaries up and down the state.
Yeah.
Like, if we want that now, like, this is the fastest way. So it's like, yes, a duopoly gets their hands in it again, as massive corporations do, but the tribes can get paid and can keep that advantage we gave them. So
I think I've heard it described as like there's the reality that we wish that we lived in, which is that medical companies weren't the only supply of legal high THC cannabis in Minnesota. And then there's the reality that we live in, which is that they legally are. Yeah. So how do we continue to expand access? This seems like one of those things that it just means more access to cannabis, even though it's not the people necessarily that I want selling it. It's still more access to cannabis for more people, which is ultimately a good thing.
That is the point in the end. Yeah.
So moving on a little bit, because we could talk about that one, I think, for a long time. Let's talk a little bit about taxes, everyone's favorite topic. Ooh. So here in Minnesota, we probably know by now, we've got that 10% sales tax on cannabis. Low potency, adult use, it's all the same. There's a bill that was introduced that would look to lower that tax by 2%, so down from 10 to 8%, and instead would allow local municipalities to impose a 2% local tax on cannabis sales to help pay for the cost of regulation. So still, the total tax is never exceeding 10%, which is what it is today. It just sort of shifts 2% of that from going directly to the state to 2% of that being used by municipalities to help in the regulation of cannabis. Yeah. What are like your thoughts on that initial measure?
Like, for people who aren't following, it's like you're allowed 8% by the state. That's hard. And then the cities can choose. So it's like, I like it. It's like, I don't know, some cities are going to let it go to create more competition in their areas. Some cities are going to use that 2%. And the thing I'm most curious about, if a city does the 2%, they amass this big amounts, they only need a fraction of it to regulate cannabis. What happens to the rest? Does the state just say, thank you very much and take it? Or do they let the city find, like, it seems like it's a good change, but I think it also opens up more of like the city litigation bullshit. Mind my language.
No, but totally agree, where it's sort of we got to pay for the program. It's like, how much does it cost? And it's like, well, we don't know yet. So I guess we pay for it this way. And it's like, well, that could be, I mean, think about like you're the city of Minneapolis, you charge 2% sales tax. Like, how much is that pot going to be at the end of a sales year? Like, that's a decent amount of chunk.
And it's like, they have to, because they can get a report requested from the commissioner at any time. So you have to show how you're using the money, how you're keeping it separate. It just doesn't seem realistic for it to be like cannabis regulated. Like, even though it's like, and I think I was reading it wrong, whereas I thought they couldn't reimburse another city. That's how I thought I read it. Whereas like, you cannot use this money for increased enforcement from other cities' law enforcement.
No, so I think it's more of like, let's say you're a city and you need county support with like helping to regulate. This would allow you to take some of that city coffer, transfer it to the county to pay for like that stuff. And I don't think it's allowing like Minneapolis to pay Bloomington for regulatory services.
Yeah. Where it's like, well, we need all these Bloomington.
Or I also don't think that it can be used as, hey, we've got a lot of cannabis sales, and that means more people are smoking cannabis, which means we need more police generally. Yeah. My understanding that this will be used just for the
saying, where it's like, you can't say because of how much cannabis we're bringing in, we need to increase enforcement. Use that.
It's just the enforcement on like that business side. We're not going to be, hopefully at least, as the bill's written now, see a ton of extra enforcement.
The bill's one page. So when that one page stretches out a little bit.
It'll stretch out a lot. All right, let's talk about two other bills. Another one that's really important, introduced by our friend Jess Hansen, House File 3760. It provides additional protections for medical cannabis patients. There's a lot that is already in our program that doesn't really have a ton of enforcement behind it. You know, the idea is you're not allowed to discriminate against medical patients, but what happens when people do?
Yes, this especially when it's a licensed medical patient.
Absolutely.
Like when they're licensed professionals. I know a lot of this one came from the nurses just being like, we want to get on the medical program, but we're scared. So it's not changing anything. It's just strengthening protections we already had. We're a healthcare state, medical state. So as we bring in these new cannabis laws, we have to make sure we protect the people that keep us a great healthcare state.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last bill that we're going to touch on, and we're just going to briefly touch on it because we're actually, as we mentioned at the beginning, going to come back to it at the way end. House File 3766. It would expand our caregiver program in Minnesota to allow caregivers to not just pick up cannabis from a licensed dispensary, but to also be able to grow cannabis for a medical patient. There are limits on how many caregivers, or excuse me, how many patients a caregiver can have, how many plants they would be allowed to grow because of that. But it would allow medical patients to have an additional source of their cannabis outside of just the 2 medical distributors that we have in the state.
Yeah, which I would say, like, we know most people do not use the medical program here. Like, most people who should be on the program aren't using it. So I love this bill a lot as, like, a real effort to get what is going on, the grassroots exchanging of cannabis and growing. Just like legalize it and legalize everything that's fucking going on, because like if it's happening, it's happening among consenting adults. And I love that. I love that it's like you can have your 6 patients, and I don't know, I think you don't need more than that, and it's all going to be cleared through the Office of Medical Cannabis. This one would be, I'd love to see this go through. Yeah,
I really encourage people to listen through all the way to the end. I think it's a really great conversation with Kayla and Adam. They talk about this bill, some of the reasons behind it. But I think what most connected with me is that this is already happening. We already have people that are growing at home, trying to supply people with cannabis they can use medicinally. And this would just formalize that process, allow them to have expanded access to it, and really take what's been going on and make it above board, which is sort of what the whole mission of the office is.
This is one of the things that you can ask those medical companies. They know they don't reach everybody.
Yeah.
This is a way to reach patients where they're at with people they trust. I like it.
Yeah, absolutely.